Although Varka only became playable very recently, we already knew quite a bit about him ever since the game's launch. We knew him as the real Grandmaster who was out on an expedition, whose reputation preceded him as many of the knights regarded him highly. Nonetheless, we also had an insight into his flaws very early on, as Jean's character stories revealed that he tends to dump a lot of his work onto her. And when Albedo was released, he had a voice line on Varka where he expressed that Jean would make a better Grandmaster. Now that he's released, we see him exhibit the same behavior, showing the consistency in his character writing from the beginning. But now we get the opportunity to better understand why he is like that and what that says about him and Jean. So let's get into it, but warning, this contains spoilers for his character stories, his story quest, and maybe some anecdotes as well. The thing about Varka is that he seems to be a very courageous knight who excels in combat and who knows how to face tough situations, and on top of that, he's also quite friendly. Therefore, it's not wrong to say that Varka is deserving of glory and recognition. But glory and recognition don't need to take the form of a position he doesn't really fit in. What I mean by this is that the position of Grandmaster isn't just a testament to one's merit, but a job title with an actual job description. It's not like Risley's Duke title, which is an award, which is separate from his job as the Warden. Meanwhile, the Grandmaster title describes a role that requires some degree of combat excellence, sure, but it also involves a lot of managerial work, including paperwork, auditing, planning, and the like. So someone's merits as a warrior has minimal bearing on the role, considering that in times of peace, combat would only end up being less than half of the Grandmaster's tasks, because although the knights are warriors, their primary objective is to govern the city, and you can't govern just by swinging your weapon. I'm not saying that Varka is absolutely incapable of this, but it's not one of his core strengths, and that greatly affects his ability to do certain parts of his job. Interestingly, I'm not the only one to think that. The previous Grandmaster before him, Valentine, rejected Varka's application to become a knight at first, not because he was weak, but because Valentine was under the impression that Varka didn't understand what it meant to be a knight. He said that if he were to accept Varka into the knights at that point, he predicted that Varka would end up quitting after 3 years because of the loads of paperwork. Hence, he recommended an alternative career path for Varka to explore, and that was for him to try out adventuring or going on expeditions, considering his personality. That way, he would learn about himself, and the next time he tries to apply for the Knights, it would be a more well-informed decision. And indeed, after adventuring and looking for his answer, when Varka got to talk to Seamus Pegg, an adventurer from Nodcry who later became Jean and Barbara's dad, Varka realized that he missed home. And I think this is what made him realize that he'd prefer to be a knight than an adventurer, even if the latter option provided more opportunities for thrilling combat situations. However, interestingly, Varka's character stories don't really detail exactly how he ascended to the role of Grandmaster or how exactly Valentine accepted him into the Knights. So I guess we can just assume that Valentine made this decision upon seeing Varka's growth. While it makes sense to me that Valentine would accept Varka into the Knights, it's still not the most clear to me why he made Varka the Grandmaster, considering the fact that even until now, Varka is still avoidant of paperwork, which means he hadn't exactly left behind his ideas of being a mainly combative knight. But I think I can hazard a guess as to how this happened. To do that, I think we have to look at Varka's approach to problem solving, which is a reflection of his traits. In his story quest, we can see that he's a decent enough planner, but he also mentions that he prefers making things up or finding things out as he goes along instead of having everything literally planned down to the last detail before it's meant to be executed. I believe this points to his flexibility and creativity, which are desirable traits to have in a leader. This allows him to think under pressure and respond to rapidly evolving situations without crumbling under pressure, thus making him very decisive and reliable. But from what I'm seeing, this side of him seems to be mostly unlocked when he's facing an imminent threat. That's what makes him such a good warrior after all. But in times of relative peace and stability, I think his brain doesn't receive enough stimulation to unlock his creative problem solving. I'm not saying that he can't think at all outside of combat, but it doesn't seem to be the ideal situation to unlock his potential. Basically, I think he has a personality of a crammer. Not in the sense that he's procrastinating, but more so in that he thrives in high-stakes scenarios rather than in situations of stability. Like any other approach, it has its strengths and its weaknesses. For one, I think this aspect of Varka's personality allowed him to ascend to the position of Grandmaster at a young age, even though he admits he was unprepared, because I surmise that Valentine recognized that Varka would be someone who could rise up to the challenge. Even if he doesn't know everything beforehand, he can find out what to do in the moment, so that means he could theoretically learn on the job as he figures things out. With this, I believe Varka was applying the saying, fake it till you make it, and also the saying, F around and find out. I think another part of the reason why Varka was made to be the Grandmaster is that he seemed like the most viable option at that time compared to the others. Although we don't really know who else was in the running, I assume perhaps Erok and Frederica were possible candidates. They seemed to be more conscientious and also stricter. I'm sure they must have had their own merits as well, especially Frederica, but I wonder if Valentine thought that the Grand Master shouldn't have an imposing or stifling personality or approach to work because one, it can affect the morale of their subordinates, thus making them more inefficient, and second, it seems contrary to the ideal of freedom which Mondstadt is supposed to champion. Compared to these kinds of candidates, Valentine probably thought that Varka already had a good attitude and he gained some wisdom from his travels, so he was probably like, okay, this guy can learn on the job because tasks can be learned, but it's harder to teach someone the right attitude. Aside from this, Varka's character story mentions that he witnessed the knights of Valentine's generation growing older and weaker, and then Varka mentions in his voice line about Jean that he rose to the position at a rather young age. Therefore, I think it's not far-fetched to imagine that there might have been some sort of power vacuum, with there being very little viable talent within the knights whose ages were between Valentine's and Varka's. As someone who helped decide on succession planning for a school org, I get that ideal options aren't always available, so choosing successors also comes with trade-offs. However, this approach of Varka's also comes with its costs. Although Varka probably intended to become a more well-rounded knight who could accomplish more paperwork once he took on the role of Grandmaster, I think he couldn't make a complete shift from his current approach. He still ended up going on many expeditions despite being the Grandmaster already, and this was even before the recently completed Nodcry expedition. Initially, when I read Jean's character stories and I saw that Varka was described as the Knight of Expeditions, I thought it was only referring to the Nodcry expedition, but no, that's pretty much what he specializes in. This guy leaves the city regularly. And so when you look at Varka's character teaser without this context, it seems like he sacrificed the opportunity to become a hero in favor of going on an expedition with a greater goal. Which is true on one hand, but on the other hand, you realize expeditions are his forte anyway, so I think he was greatly happy to do that. The fact that he goes on a lot of expeditions contextualizes this decision. It's not exactly that he rose to the challenge simply because of a sense of duty, but also partially out of a desire to do what he does best. The problem is that he sometimes gets locked into only doing what he does best. The thing is, this hasn't always ended well for Varka. Before he left for this specific Nodcry expedition, he went on a different expedition, leaving Inspector Erok in charge. During this time, jealousy took root in Erok's heart, so he ended up being lured by Dotora into his plan, which led to Ursa the Drake attacking Krepus's caravan, and Krepus dying when he used his delusion against it. This is what caused Diluc to leave the Knights through a long chain of events. So this all happened while Varka was away, and when he got back and confronted Erok, Erok blamed Varka and offed himself in front of him. Now this must have been a very traumatic experience for Varka, and I'm not blaming him exactly because it's Erok's fault, not Varka's. But Varka's absence didn't exactly help the situation. Who knows what he could have done if he were present to oversee things. Interestingly, I think the situation had a somewhat unexpected effect on Varka. Instead of him being traumatized about the prospect of leaving Mondstadt for yet another expedition, I think he doubled down on this approach because he might have internalized a sense of insecurity about his leadership style. Maybe he thought of this Erok situation as proof that expeditions are his forte and he feels stumped dealing with other nitty-gritty political issues. Perhaps this is also why he needed lots of assistance from Jean and Kaya when it came to investigating Erok, despite them still being young at that time. This is just my guess though, take it with a grain of salt. So when the opportunity to go on an expedition arrived once more, I think Varka embraced it as his means for redemption. If he could go on a successful expedition this time, maybe it would undo his guilt from the last time, and it could prove that he can do good for Mondstadt by playing into his strengths. And that's a wonderful thing, truly. But some fans defend Varka offloading his work onto Jean by saying that he planned this whole mentorship strategy for her, so by the time he needed to go on an expedition, she would be ready to serve as the acting Grandmaster. However, I think it's more so the case that he chanced upon a possible solution to his weakness in the form of Jean. As I said, he figures things out as he goes along, so I think he struggled with paperwork, and when he found someone who could do it, he thought of this division of labor as a convenient solution. And when it came time for him to go on the expedition to Nodcry, a convenient excuse also fell in his lap. He could now justify his offloading of work onto Jean by saying that it actually helped her take on the role of acting Grandmaster. But Varka previously went on many expeditions and didn't provide a clear mentorship structure, with him providing hands-on instruction and guidance. Combined with the fact that he's very spontaneous, it's unlikely that he planned literally everything from the get-go. That's not to say that he didn't have any good intentions at all, but it seems to be that he wanted to kill two birds with one stone so that he could let Jean grow into his successor while also having a convenient solution to his weaknesses with dealing with paperwork. After all, in the recent Mondstadt event, when he invited Jean to join them for a drink, Jean declined because of pending tasks, but she said she could make it if Varka helped her finish her work earlier. This led Varka to basically take back his invitation so that he wouldn't have to work alongside Jean. So yes, he does care about his subordinates, but his convenience remains a priority in certain cases. So yes, while Varka's traits are greatly helpful in allowing him to take on major challenges with little preparation, it can also lead to negative consequences if he doesn't find the right people to compensate for his weaknesses. If Jean turned out to be resentful to the point of causing destruction, then Varka would have run into similar problems again upon his return. So he's just kinda lucky to have Jean in this case. Fortunately, he was more prepared this time around because he asked Barbatos and the Hexen Circle to help defend Mondstadt in his absence. I do think it's a good thing that Varka relies on other people, because a good leader knows how to delegate tasks to their subordinates or ask for support from allies. However, while Varka is humble enough to recognize his shortcomings, he's not exactly humble enough to let go of his current approach to leadership and relearn some aspects of his job. I think it would be better for him to find a balance so that he can rely on others without it turning into excessive over-reliance, so that he can create an environment of mutual support. On the surface, it's easy to characterize Jean as someone who's the opposite of Varka. She's strict and he's lax, so they even out each other and their strengths compensate for the other's weaknesses. But that's kinda inaccurate. You see, Jean is very conscientious and hardworking, but she's not strict in an imposing way. Sure, she tells Varka to do his work and she puts people in confinement, but she's only doing that because of existing rules that she wants to uphold fairly. She's not really a micromanager. She doesn't mind if Lisa sleeps on the job as long as she does what's necessary. She doesn't mind that Kaya goes to the tavern midday as long as he does his work at his own time, and she constantly tells Traveler to take a break even while they're fulfilling their role as an honorary knight. She's not nitpicky and critical when it comes to other people's work, and she trusts the other knights enough for her to delegate work to them. That's why she sends Kaya on wine research trips abroad, and that's also why she asks Varka to help her with her work, because she doesn't have this mentality that she can do everything better. Aside from this, Jean is also a pretty strong warrior. She's quite adept at Favonius blade work, and she can take down ruin guards as well. So it's not like she's only capable of logistics either. And although I mentioned that she's anxious, it doesn't necessarily prevent her from making clear decisions on the spot. Of course, she seems to be the type of person who prefers structure and clearly outlined plans ahead of time, but she doesn't bog down when she has to decide on the spot. So, what am I getting at? Basically, I think Varka could serve as a really good complementary force to a master or acting grandmaster who is either too strict, too physically weak, or too indecisive. If the knights had an acting grandmaster who put pressure on other people, as much as they did on themselves, then Varka would easily feel like a breath of fresh air for their subordinates. However, since Jean only really internalizes her pressure and doesn't impose it on others, her subordinates aren't in such a major need of someone who's exceptionally carefree to balance her out. If they had a physically weak acting grandmaster, then they would need a grandmaster to oversee most of the combat. And if they had an indecisive acting grandmaster, then the grandmaster's decision-making wisdom could be very much appreciated. However, Jean's problem is anxiety that stems from internalized pressure, so the type of person who can serve as her complement and make her a better leader would be someone who is chill in such a way that relieves her anxiety rather than adds on to it. And the best thing is, this person already exists, and there's actually two of them. We have Lisa, who assists Jean with audits, documentation, potion shop manning, and similar things she's capable of. And we also have Kaya, who assists Jean with paperwork, trade concerns, wine market research, among others. So she has one person to complement her from within her chain of command, that's Kaya, her direct subordinate, and another one sorta outside of her direct chain of command, which is Lisa, who works as a librarian. These two people are able to support Jean in a more collaborative way, rather than them just being rigidly segregated in terms of tasks and purpose. They build onto each other's strengths rather than just sorta outsourcing their weaknesses to other people. Let me create an analogy for the situation. If Varka and Jean were classmates in high school, Varka might be the type to say, "Let's partner up for all our projects and I'll do all of the art or creative stuff while you do all of the writing and research." It seems fair on the surface, but as we know, artistic projects don't come around as often as reports and essays. So if they happen to need a little papier-mâché project, then Varka will do all the heavy lifting there is. But for PowerPoint presentations, Varka would end up only choosing the slide designs while Jean does most of the writing. Whereas let's say if Jean were to partner up with someone like Lisa or Kaya, they'll divide tasks in a way that they both get to do art and they also both get to write depending on the project. Maybe one will specialize more in drawing and ornamentation while the other does more assembling when it comes to the art stuff. Then when it comes to the reports, maybe one will do, let's say, more of the intro and methodology while the other one does more results in discussion and conclusion. With the latter, both people still play to their strengths and let the other support them with their weaknesses, but they're not delineating such strict lines regarding what they can or can't do. I'm not saying that Varka is lazy, and indeed, sometimes he does do his work upon Jean's prompting, but I think he needs to develop more flexibility in the way he thinks of his role and the other knight's roles. I understand that he found success in doing what he does best, and on the surface, division of labor can seem quite efficient, but he needs to find a better balance, especially when dealing with the subordinates who are a bit more well-rounded in their capabilities than he is, or subordinates who are at least willing to do things they aren't the most comfortable with compared to Varka, who is unwilling to do things that he's decent at but not the best at. Actually, I believe this trend goes beyond just Varka and Jean. To me, it seems to be the case that there are quite a number of knights in Jean's cohort that are very well-rounded. Even, let's say, more combative characters like Eula do some logistics work as well. Knights who are more into research like Albedo are also decent at combat. In truth, Varka himself is skilled in many areas. Fighting is his forte, but he's good at coordination, studying history, and conducting investigations. He's not someone who's all brawn and no brains at all. I think it might have just been the way he was trained as a knight. Perhaps he was taught to specialize rather than diversify. And that's something that he stuck with as he was finding his footing as the Grand Master. Plus, like I said, it kinda seems like there weren't that many reliable or exceptional knights within his generation compared to the current one. So I think he was just trying to do his best, and Valentine was also just trying to do his best with his human resource management and succession planning. Like I said, choosing Varka at that time might have been the most optimal decision considering the options. However, since the new generation of knights seems to have a lot more members with more diversified talents, it would be good for the older generation to do justice to that. In a sense, Varka has a very high regard for this current generation, and this comes out in his great trust in them. Enough for him to leave certain tasks in their hands with minimal supervision. And I think this is something really admirable about Varka's character. Nonetheless, as I mentioned, I believe this isn't necessarily enough. I think beyond just trusting the new generation, he also needs to keep up with them. It's his duty to support them after all. I understand that Varka has plans of giving up his position to Jean, and she's the one who doesn't want to accept it. As much as I love Jean and hold her in high regard, I think this is a clear demonstration of one of her greatest flaws, because she internalizes the pressure. She thinks that being hard on herself while being kind to others will spare them from that burden. But she doesn't realize that this self-consciousness also has its costs. For one, she neglects the fact that her fellow knights have empathy for her, so even they feel bothered by her anxiety due to their worry for her. And another thing is that she claims to want the best for the knights, but she's discounting the fact that her unwillingness to accept the Grand Master position means that the knights are currently missing out on a more optimal and efficient leadership structure. So it's like her anxiety takes precedence over logic in this particular case. And that's something she could learn from Varka, who I presume was able to take the Grand Master position gracefully due to his confidence and his ability to wing it. But Jean also didn't become like this completely on her own. She received lots of pressure from her mother, and Varka probably intended for his chillness to have a positive influence on her, but instead his offloading of work onto her only served as validation for her extreme feelings of responsibility. He's literally proving to her that she needs to be perfect, because who else will the knights rely on, right? And of course, Eroc's betrayal fractured the knights so much that Jean was burdened with the responsibility of investigating him, further proving to her that her hard work was needed and that she didn't have room for failure. So that means that the pressure she received wasn't only from her mom, but the entire system. And it's not just her. In the first Mondstadt bartending event, we also got some hints of Diluc receiving pressure from Crepus to become an exceptional knight because he himself wasn't able to become one. Then now in the recent bartending event, Varka discussed how Ferro, the former cavalry captain before Diluc, was quite strict, and Varka made a remark about how Ferro should concede to the next generation of knights being better than him. To me, this points to an overall pattern of interpersonal struggles being passed down from generation to generation. Perhaps it would warrant the usage of the term generational trauma, but I don't know if I'm using it properly because it has kind of become a buzzword. But regardless of terminology, I think what happened is each generation of knights tried to do their best with what they were given, and they taught the next generation based on whatever wisdom they had, even if it was incomplete or maybe a bit outdated. And then this generation carried those problems over to the next. For instance, my understanding of Valentine is that he probably wanted Varka to cultivate his strengths, and this resulted in Varka taking on a more narrow approach to skills development. Then Varka noticed where he was lacking and saw the next generation exceeded his abilities, but that self-awareness led him to the conclusion that he should leave things to them with minimal hands-on guidance. And that's why you have people like Jean and maybe even Mika feeling like they need to do everything. Now, I'm sure Jean's generation might pass on some of its problems to the next, but I think her cohort is shown to improve things significantly. Because Jean is both proactive and trusting, it inspires her subordinates to find their own talents while applying them in multiple scenarios to help her when the knights were greatly understaffed. And with the likes of Lisa, Albedo, and Kaya practicing their mentorship skills on Klee, Razor, Durin, and Mika, this will help them cultivate the skills necessary to shape the next generation of knights in a way that respects their freedom while also providing them with structure so they don't feel unsupported. Heck, even Mika gets to assist his own senior, Lohan, in adjusting to new tasks, so I think that there's a lot of hope for the knights moving forward. So where does this leave Varka? Like I said, the problem with Varka isn't necessarily his entire personality, but the fact that he's been mismatched to his job. His job involves a lot of tasks that he doesn't necessarily feel comfortable doing, regardless of whether or not he's decent enough at executing them. Hence, the obvious solution would be for him to give up the Grandmaster position to Jean, while he takes up a special position within the Knights if he still wants to continue serving them. He could establish a sort of ad hoc expedition squad and lead that, or he could be in charge of combat training. There are many possibilities for him to pursue within the Knights, even if he lets go of his position. Yet, as he expressed, Jean isn't willing to take up this offer yet, so what should he do? I think in the meantime, he should really put in the work to prepare a more structured transition period. He can't expect Jean to rise to the challenge without enough reassurance and guidance. Although he claims that Jean has already been doing his job for a while, and she has been the acting Grandmaster already, but I think Varka needs to give her more mental preparation in terms of how to gain confidence or how to embrace a position of authority, because clearly Jean can do the tasks. It's just her hesitation that's holding her back. And in the meantime, while the transition is ongoing, Varka should challenge himself to do more of the logistical, managerial, clerical aspects of the Grandmaster role to further benefit his subordinates and develop himself into a more well-rounded knight. This way, the transition of power to Jean will feel smoother, and he can also continue to grow along the way. Like I said, Varka has a lot of good intentions, but he just needs to adjust and find more optimal ways of doing things, even though he has already gotten used to thinking of plans spontaneously, because while those work on expeditions, those don't necessarily work when he's governing the city. All of this to say, Varka isn't mean or inconsiderate at all, but I just want to discuss that he's not goofy on the surface but is secretly wise. I think Varka's deal is more so that he is deeply flawed and has many outdated approaches to work, but despite that, he is still trying his best, and that intention shines through his interactions. Sometimes we must admit that his best isn't good enough, or maybe that sometimes he's not even trying his best, like when it comes to paperwork. But that doesn't make him an inherently bad leader. It just means he has lots of room for improvement, even at his age. So that's all for today. I hope I was able to provide an interesting and nuanced commentary on the work dynamic between Varka and Jean. If you like this video, I hope you could consider checking out my other ones if you're into in-depth character and lore analysis. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.